Hi, everyone. Hope you had a nice time on the Sounds Terrace. Bit short. Maybe we might change the timing a bit more so you can have a longer time to drink your wine rather than scull, as maybe you did. I'm sure you didn't, though. Good evening and welcome to the 2024 Sir Charles Nicholson Annual Lecture. So my name is Paul Donnelly. I'm the Deputy Director of the Chau Museum here. In beginning, I would like to acknowledge we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. The museum in which we are meeting tonight sits within a landscape that for millennia has been a place of teaching, sharing, and learning. The Sir Charles Nicholson Lecture is an event where we celebrate Nicholson's foresight in establishing collections and antiquity as a fundamental part of the student experience here at the University of Sydney. Not by coincidence, this event is held as close to his birthday as possible, the 23rd of November. So Nicholson was born in 1808, making this his 216th birthday. So happy birthday, Sir Charles. The Sir Charles Nicholson Lecture was established in 2017 as an opportunity to celebrate his visionary contribution. We feel confident he would approve of this being an opportunity to welcome international and national leaders in their fields, to share their research and experiences of antiquity in the disciplines of archaeology and museology. Former invited speakers have included Dr. Irving Finkel and Dr. Alexander Fletcher, both from the British Museum, Associate Professor Alice Stevenson, Director of UCL Museum Studies, and last year, Dr. Anastasia Christopholopoulou of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Tonight, we are delighted to add to this illustrious list Andrew Jamieson. Andrew is Associate Professor in Near Recent Archaeology in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. For more than 3 decades, he has participated in archaeological fieldwork in Egypt, Georgia, Lebanon, Syria, and Australia. He's been especially active in preservation and salvage projects. In 2017, Andrew became the director of the Georgian-Australian investigations in archaeology at the GAIA project, GAIA project. He's also an award-winning teacher whose work in the sphere of object-based learning has been highly influential, both in Australia and internationally. And I must say, when we were designing this building, we visited you many times and got some fantastic ideas for our own object-based learning studios. He's very active in the field of community engagement, promoting the ancient world within the wider community and fostering interest in university activities. He's an elected Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, and in 2023 was the recipient of the Faculty of Arts Alumni Award for his contribution to the faculty and university. Andrew's talk tonight is titled Looking Back on Syria, Moving Forward in Georgia, Near Recent Archaeology at the University of Melbourne. Please join me in welcoming Andrew to the lectern.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. It's great, really great to be here in Sydney. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. May I also express my great appreciation to Paul Donnelly, Craig Barker and the Chak Wing team for inviting me to give the 2024 Sir Charles Nicholson Lecture. In fact, it was Paul who suggested the topic for tonight's talk. To quote Paul, "We did wonder if you would like to speak from the perspective of a researcher unable to return to Syria and how you compensate." So tonight's talk is very much a personal account of my archaeological experiences, looking back on Syria and moving forward in Georgia. But I thought it might be interesting to begin with what others think of this shift in research and career trajectory. On investigator capability, peers note in 2019, and I quote, "Jamieson is new to this area after no longer being able to work in Syria. This project is a change in research location geographically and contextually from curatorial context to field excavation and landscape archaeology. There is as yet no strong record of impact or engagement with the present project context. And in 2020, I quote, Jamieson's field experience lies elsewhere. Since 2018, he seems to have been gaining experience in field conditions in Georgia. His strengths are clearly curatorial studies and Syrian material culture, having no record in the context of the South Caucasus. Archaeology is not a career, as we say in Melbourne, it's a vendetta. But clearly, as a researcher unable to return to Syria is not without its challenges. Now, to help frame tonight's talk, I want to start with some preliminary definitions. The first relates to the point that I've just alluded to, and that's my experiences in archaeology. And this fits into what may be defined as life writing in the history of archaeology. And I quote again from Claire Lewis and Gabriel Moshenka, who note, life writing is a literal translation of biography, but in practice it represents a far broader category of texts and related forms: memory studies, linguistics, history and philosophy of science. Life writing has played a vital role in the emergence and the development of archaeology, from the memoirs of early modern antiquarian travellers to the rise of object biography approaches in the late 20th century. The second definition concerns Near Eastern archaeology itself. Reinhard Bernbeck describes in his chapter on the political dimensions of archaeological practices, I quote, even the very name of our discipline in different languages makes clear that the regions of our interest are to be seen from a specific position, and that this position is still Europe and the West more broadly. I've used Near Eastern in the title of my talk, just as Bernbeck's paper appears in Dan Potts' Companion to the Archaeology of the Ancient Near East. I recognise Near Eastern is troublesome, but tonight I'm staying with the trouble. The third definition is about geography. Adam Smith examines the Caucasus and Near East, also published in the Companion to the Archaeology of the Ancient Near East. And according to Smith, I quote, the first challenge in examining the relationship between the prehistoric Caucasus and the ancient Near East is defining geographically where one ends and the other begins. Smith explains, I quote, that the Caucasus includes the three independent republics of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, noting there is compelling evidence for interactions, exchanges, population movements between the Caucasus and its Near Eastern neighbours. So having made these preliminary comments, let me outline the roadmap for this talk. I want to begin with a background to Near Eastern archaeology at the University of Melbourne as a context for my work in looking back on Syria and going forward in Georgia. And I'll very much focus those around the work at Tell Ahmar in Syria and ancient Rabati in Georgia. And I'll conclude with some comments about challenges and future directions of ancient Near Eastern studies. How does that sound? All right, good. So, sowing the seeds, the origins of ancient Near Eastern archaeology at Melbourne. It was Jessie Webb, an historian, who first introduced snippets of Near Eastern archaeology at the University of Melbourne. As a result of her tour in 1936 to North Africa, Greece, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Cyprus, when she visited the Sumerian, Babylonian, Hittite, and Hellenistic sites, Jessie's courses expanded to include the ancient world in the Mediterranean and the Near East. Jessie's most fundamental contribution to the students' awareness was that they were not allowed to imagine that everything began and ended with the Greeks and Romans. Now, importantly, Jessie was also responsible for the acquisition of objects to enhance her teaching of the ancient world. Jesse's successor was Jack O'Brien, a brilliant linguist who taught himself Egyptian hieroglyphs and was fascinated by Linear B. Jack's first syllabi, inherited from Jesse, covered a general view of the ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Middle East from prehistoric times to the 4th century CE. In 1954, a second appointment was made in the ancient field. John Mulvaney, probably O'Brien's most famous student. Immediately upon graduation, he'd been appointed tutor, but then followed the traditional path to the UK, studying archaeology and anthropology at Cambridge with Graham Clark and Glyn Daniel. At Cambridge, Mulvaney was influenced by a great many archaeologists, including Charles McBurney, with whom he worked with in Libya in 1952. He returned to Melbourne to a lectureship and was promoted to senior lecturer. And then in 1965, Mulvaney moved to the ANU, where he was appointed Professor of Prehistory in 1971 to become Australia's leading archaeologist. Mulvaney's departure prompted a major shift in the focus of archaeology at Melbourne to the Old World and the Near East in particular. Now, Melbourne had already shown an interest in the Eastern Mediterranean through the sponsorship in 1955 of the Melbourne Cyprus Expedition, the first Australian enterprise in the Near East, directed by James Stewart, interestingly, of the University of Sydney. Another very important figure in these early developments is John Thompson, a sessional lecturer in biblical archaeology in the Department of Semitic Studies with funding from the Australian Institute of Archaeology. Now, because there were no archaeological schools in Australia, John headed to the Middle East in 1950, where he commenced a year as an honorary fellow at the American Schools of Oriental Research. And while at ASOR, John dug with James Pritchard and Dimitri Baramki at Divan and Jericho, and worked with Gerald Lancaster Harding at Jawa. However, it was not until the appointment of William Cullican in 1960 that the study of Near Eastern antiquity struck firm roots at Melbourne. Cullican replaced Thompson as biblical archaeology lecturer in the Department of Semitics, and he was a leading authority on the Phoenicians and Persians. His ancient linguistic skills were daunting, Egyptian, Sumerian, and Akkadian, but above all, he was a widely experienced field archaeologist. When Cullican moved across to history to replace Mulvaney, American archaeologist Thomas McClellan was appointed to fill the vacancy in what was then Middle Eastern Studies. Before coming to Melbourne, Tom had worked in Jordan and Lebanon with James Pritchard, and Tom and Bill co-directed the Australian excavations at El-Kitar in Syria. When Tom accepted a post at Chicago at the end of 1985, he was replaced by Belgian Assyriologist Guy Boonens. Guy had studied Akkadian under noted Assyriologist Georges Dossan, and I think you'd probably know that the Fisher Library acquired Dossan's library. During his tenure at Melbourne, Boonens directed the rescue excavations at Tell Ahmar in Syria, which we'll get to shortly. With Cullican's sudden death in his sleep at the beginning of 1984, Tony Sagona stepped in to run Bill's courses. Tony had worked with Cullican and McClellan at El-Kitar and went on to dig in Turkey and later Georgia. He was particularly interested in the origins of the early Bronze Age Kura-Araxes culture. Now, this survey would not be complete without mentioning Peter Connor and Heather Jackson, Graham Clark and John Tidmarsh, and the Jebel Khalid project, a joint initiative between the University of Melbourne and the Australian National University. Now, from this all too brief overview, it's possible to trace the origin and development of Near Eastern archaeology at Melbourne, a feature of the curriculum, research, fieldwork, and publications for over 70 years. So let's now look back on Syria. First, I'll talk about my involvement at Tell Ahmar and then discuss the Syrian-Australian Research Collaboration Project that was established in 2008, but sadly cut short due to the civil war, which forced all activity in Syria to cease. I'll also talk about responses to the conflict in Syria before moving on to work in Georgia. Now, many of you would be aware that before the Australian excavations at Tell Ahmar, a French team had worked at the site from 1929 to 1931 under the auspices of the Louvre. Francois Thoreau-Dangean directed the excavations with the assistance of Maurice Dunard, Lucien Cavereau and Georges Dassin. The Australian-led excavations at Tell Ahmar were directed by Guy and Arlette Bunnens, a former student of Dassin, and this connection would not have escaped the attention of the Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums in Damascus when it came to allocating excavation permits. And from the inception of the Australian project, I was involved as the expedition's ceramicist. Tell Ahmar is situated on the east bank of the Euphrates River, approximately 20 kilometres below Carchemish. It commanded a position of great strategic importance in this middle and upper Euphrates Valley of northern Syria. Now, Tell Ahmar was one of 20 or so sites threatened with destruction resulting from the construction of the Tishreen hydroelectric dam. And in responding to an international call for assistance, the University of Melbourne commenced salvage excavations at Tell Ahmar in 1988. Now, at this point, I should say something about the different names of Tell Ahmar. Its modern name, Tell Ahmar, of course, means Red Mound. Its Hittite or Luvian name is Mazawari. Tilbarsib or Tabasiba is its Aramean name, and its Neo-Assyrian name is Kar-Shalmaneser. Now, Tell Ahmar was inhabited as early as the Neolithic period, but it's the remains of the Iron Age city, which is the most important settlement at the site. The city was largely Neo-Hittite up to the conquest by the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 856 BC. At the time, Tilbarsib was in the area of the Aramean-speaking Syro-Hittite state of Bitadini. Now, when it was captured by the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, the city was renamed Kar-Shalmaneser. And following the Assyrian conquest, Tell Ahmar became a provincial centre for the empire's administration due to its strategic location. Now, Tell Ahmar is a large site comprising of three main parts. The first is the Tell or the Acropolis, overlooking the floodplain. The second, Middle City, extends over several hundred metres westwards from the Acropolis. And the third comprises the semicircular Lower City, extending to the north of the Acropolis. Important to note that both the Middle and the Lower City were built up during that first millennium, Iron Age, Neo-Assyrian period. Now, the French excavations concentrated on the Acropolis, on the main Tell and the city gate. On top of the Tell, they found a mud brick palace, the residence of a provincial governor. The throne room and other areas were decorated with wall paintings in black, red and blue. And they are some of the only surviving examples of Assyrian painting in existence. Below the palace, the French discovered the famous Tilbarsib hypogeum, an early Bronze Age burial containing over 1,000 pots, skeletal remains of 2 male adults, bronze weapons, and animal bones. The French also recorded 2 basalt lions marking the entrance to the town. A cuneiform inscription on one of the lions mentions the name of the site, Kar-Shalmaneser, or Shalmaneser's Port. Now, possibly because the French did not find the palace archive, work ceased after only 3 seasons. The University of Melbourne resumed work in 1988. Now, since the French had concentrated their efforts on the Acropolis, we decided to focus our attention in the Middle and Lower City. and of particular importance were the excavations in Area C. Just below the surface, in the middle city, we found a series of well-preserved buildings. All of these buildings were constructed around open courtyards. And although there were traces of industrial activities found in Building C2, the function of the building as a residence, an elite residence, is clearly indicated by features such as Room 6, which are typical of Neo-Assyrian reception rooms. This was the Turak of Tell Ahmar. The courtyard of Building C2 featured a black and white pebble mosaic. 20 cuneiform tablets were found in Building C1A. Most date to the second half of the reign of Ashurbanipal. One name, Hani, appears several times in these tablets, and it may be assumed that Hani is the owner of the house or houses and owner of the archive. The contents of the archive indicate that Hani was a businessman, lending silver and buying slaves. 20 ivories were also found, the largest, reflecting Egyptian and Syro-Hittite features, depicts a procession of figures carrying provisions, grapes, pomegranates, small birds and fish for a banquet, and are being led by a figure playing a flute. But by far the greatest quantity of material in Area C was pottery, the topic of my PhD. Diagnostic features enable the pottery to be dated to the second half of the 7th century. Ceramic imports from Anatolia, Cyprus, Phoenicia, the Levant, northern Mesopotamia enriched the assemblage. The greatest and closest parallels of the Area C pottery are with the ceramics from Nimrud. Now, near the houses in Area C was found a tomb constructed of baked bricks. Other than a terracotta bathtub sarcophagus, the burial was completely empty. A hole in the roof was possibly made by tomb robbers. Above the tomb were found fragments of a life-size basalt statue. Only the feet were missing. The beardless figure suggests it may have been a palace eunuch. The figure was deliberately damaged in antiquity, face erased, chest punctured, indicating a possible ritual killing and burial, so the proximity to the tomb may not be accidental. Another stele of the storm god Teshub was recovered from the Euphrates. This table, after Arnulf Hausleiter, lists selected Neo-Assyrian sites by region and 7 categories of material culture of the Assyrian elite: glazed fabrics, palace wares, ivories, reliefs and sculptures, palaces and residences, temples and Neo-Assyrian texts. All these categories are represented at Tell Ahmar. It's the only site with all 7 categories outside the Assyrian heartland, denoting the site's significance. Tell Ahmar lost its status as a regional centre with the fall of the Assyrian Empire at the end of the 7th century. The completion of the Tishreen Dam in July 1999 caused the flooding of part of the village, while most of the modern houses that had not been flooded were abandoned. The villagers carried away everything they could, in particular doors, window frames and roof beams. And during the Civil War, troops fought for control of the area. The Acropolis was bulldozed and became a military installation. As Guy Bunnens noted, and I quote, "The geographical advantages that had made the prosperity of ancient Tell Ahmar caused the ruin of the modern village." Now, with my appointment at the University of Melbourne in 2005, I began looking for a new research project. And of course, it was natural to look to Syria. In 2008, I embarked upon a new chapter of research in the upper Euphrates River Valley. And this initiative was known as the Syrian-Australian Research Collaboration Project, a partnership between the Aleppo Museum and the University of Melbourne. And I must acknowledge our Syrian partner, Dr. Yusuf Kanju, who was director of the museum and is now based at the University in Tübingen. Two objectives were identified. The first involved salvage excavations at Tell Gumluk, and the second comprised establishing a repository for archaeological collections at Qal'at Najim. Gumluk, on the east bank of the Euphrates River, is situated between Carchemish to the north and Tell Ahmar to the south. And since the completion of the Tishreen Dam, Gumluk has been cut off from the main road and is an island within the dam reservoir, making access difficult. A surface survey and test trench indicated it was a multi-period site. Floodwater caused damage around the base of the tell, requiring urgent excavation of early Bronze Age cyst burials. Now, the salvage excavations in the Euphrates Valley generated large quantities of archaeological artefacts. Some of the most significant finds went on display in the Aleppo Museum. However, it was simply not possible for the museum to accommodate all the material, and an alternative storage location was needed. Now, one potential repository was identified by the late Dr. Hamido Hamadi at Qal'at Najim, an Arab fortress on the Euphrates, approximately 20 kilometres from the modern town of Manbij. The Syrian Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums had carried out restoration work at Qal'at Najim over the years, but its full potential for tourism and other adaptive reuses had not been fully investigated. Qal'at Najim offered a storage solution for the Euphrates Valley, providing a much-needed artefact repository for the collections that could not be housed in the museums in Aleppo and Damascus. It also presented opportunities for interpretation and community engagement. In 2010, work began on the first stage in the creation of the repository. And as a pilot study, the Neo-Assyrian pottery, approximately 20,000 sherds from Tell Ahmar, was relocated to Qal'at Najim. Tragically, due to the unrest that grew out of the 2011 Arab Spring protests, it was not possible to return to Qal'at Najim or continue the excavations at Tell Gumluk. Conflict in Syria led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions of displaced people, and damage and destruction to the country's cultural heritage. Sadly, all Syria's World Heritage sites were negatively impacted. It's estimated that before the war, there were approximately 150 archaeological projects working in Syria, with archaeologists from France and Germany the most active. Now, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the response of the international archaeological community to the conflict in Syria. In 2014, at a special workshop on Syrian heritage, organised by the Swiss Society for Ancient Oriental Science as part of the 9th International Congress on the Archaeology of the Ancient Near East in Basel, SHIRAN was created. What is SHIRAN? It stands for Syrian Heritage in Danger, an international research initiative and network. SHIRAN brought together a significant proportion of those international research projects and scholars that were working in Syria prior to 2011, with the purpose of making their expertise available to wider heritage protection efforts. SHIRAN's International Committee at the time of its creation included directors of a number of long-term international research programs and others who shared their strong commitment to the effective protection of heritage of Syria, including the former head of the Department of Antiquities, Dr. Michelle Magdassi. I was invited to represent Australia on the International Committee. SHIRAN's key priorities were identified as providing archaeological experience and expertise, producing damage assessment reports, evaluating the provenance of illicitly excavated or purchased artefacts, creating databases of sites and objects. SHIRAN issued statements directed to UNESCO on the destruction and reconstruction of Palmyra and Aleppo. Members of SHIRAN also contributed to drafting an ethics charter for Near Eastern archaeology and Assyriology. The charter stated, and I quote, "Archaeologists of the ancient Near East and Assyriologists have an ethical obligation to be attuned to what is happening in the lands where they carry out their professional activities, especially when the basic human rights are being violated. The conflicts in Syria and Iraq and the subsequent instability in the entire region put scores of human lives in jeopardy and represent a serious threat to the cultural heritage of the region." Syrian International also encouraged the establishment of national committees with varying levels of success. For instance, a national committee was never established in France. In many cases, political issues combined with the lack of consensus on matters of neutrality and its interpretation contributed to these failings. An Australian Syrian National Committee was formed in 2014. Syrian Australia identified the following 4 actions: supporting Syrian colleagues, helping the Aleppo Museum, curating an exhibition and presenting a public symposium. Here I'll just mention the exhibition and symposium held at the University of Melbourne in 2017, which at the time generated considerable interest and intense debate. The exhibition at the Ian Potter Museum of Art was opened by Emeritus Professor Graham Clark. It featured over 150 objects, including finds from the Australian excavation projects in the Euphrates Valley. Greeting people as they entered the gallery was a funerary bust of a woman with Syriac inscription from Palmyra that we'd borrowed from Canberra's Australian War Memorial. It served as a powerful reminder of the destruction of Palmyra. A 2-day symposium was held in Melbourne. The keynote lecture was presented by the former Australian ambassador in Syria, Professor Ross Burns, who spoke on Aleppo and Palmyra, how monuments were weaponised in the Syrian conflict. The exhibition and symposium attracted widespread media coverage. Over 16,000 people visited the exhibition and over 500 people attended the symposium. As part of the exhibition and symposium, there were more than 20 public programs to engage the wider community. And these events covered a range of different themes and issues, such as a discussion on asylum seekers, refugees, and people fleeing persecution. The exhibition was also used as a backdrop for object-based learning classes, tutorials and seminars attended by hundreds of students in anthropology, architecture, archaeology, education, history, law, medicine, and media studies. The papers presented at the symposium were published in a monograph titled Heritage in Conflict. One goal of this monograph was to provide our Syrian and Iraqi colleagues with an opportunity to publish in a collective volume so as to make their research available to a broad readership. Too often, their voices are not heard. Now, despite the initial optimism of Syrian, attempts to form and maintain national and international committees had mixed and limited success. Differing political opinions on Syria hampered French and other nations' efforts to establish national committees. Such concerns highlight the ethical dilemma that the archaeological community faced in responding to the conflict and the various disagreements at play. The attendance of foreign archaeologists at a colloquium in Damascus in 2016 and at the reopening of the Damascus Museum in 2018 stirred debate. The presence of foreign archaeologists at these events brought into question matters of neutrality. Attending the museum opening was interpreted as an indication of support for the Syrian regime, whereas working with heritage professionals and former members of the Department of Antiquities outside of government-controlled territory was taken as supporting the opposition. Syrian formally ceased to exist in 2020. And with no end to the problems in Syria in sight, travel bans and ongoing instability, it was necessary for me to relocate my fieldwork and research plans. Moving forward in Georgia. In 2017, my colleague Tony Sagona sadly passed away. Tony and his wife Claudia had forged strong links between Melbourne and Georgia through decades of research. Tony had seized the opportunity of relocating his fieldwork from Turkey to Georgia in 2008, where he established the Georgian-Australian Investigations in Archaeology, GAIA project, a partnership with the Georgian National Museum. Before Tony died, I was invited to take over GAIA. And although he did not live to see the Rabati excavation unfold past the first season, we carry forward his vision and approach at the site. Now, the site of Rabati is part of the modern village of Zveli, located between the larger towns of Al-Kasika and Aspinza in the Samsketi-Javakheti region of southwestern Georgia. Anyone here been to Georgia? Not yet, not yet, not yet. The ancient settlement is located on the northern side of the modern village, which is on a flat highland plain at the edge of the Urasheti Mountains. The village is at an altitude of 1,480 metres above sea level, overlooking the Kura River Valley. Now, in this area, the Kura flows towards the northeast through the deep, narrow gorge. It's an important corridor passing between the Caucasus, Anatolia, and the Near East beyond. In antiquity, the Rabati summit was heavily fortified. On its northeastern side, there are uninterrupted views east and west along the valley. To the north, Rabati and the village of Zveli are bordered by forest that leads up to highland pastures. Our work at Rabati is in two areas, the settlement and burial grounds, and our aims are clear-cut. We are working towards a precise absolute chronology for the early Bronze Age Kura-Araxi and Middle Bronze Age Early Kurgan period based on a new suite of radiocarbon dates, stratigraphic evidence, and associated typological definitions of cultural artefacts. On the summit, we've opened squares in two sectors. In the central sector, the most remarkable discovery has been a massive stone structure dating to the early Bronze Age and attributed to the Kura-Araxes culture. In the western sector, well-stratified deposits dating to the Middle Bronze and Early Bronze have been found. Here, pits and fragments of plaster surfaces associated with a textile industry have been exposed, which were partially disturbed by medieval activities. Bone textile manufacturing tools and loom weights were found in dispersed squares found dispersed in squares D9 and D10. Traces of fibres in soil samples and residues on the artefacts support the manufacturing of textiles. NPP analysis undertaken by Dr. Inga Markospili confirms the remains of these textile fibres. Flax and cannabis predominate. Twisted and dyed pink fibres observed in the samples point to the processes of spinning and dyeing. Purple stained interiors have been found on some of the Middle Bronze Age pottery sherds and vessels, and we're yet to accurately identify the residue of this stained pottery, but wine in Georgia is not outside the bounds of possibility. We're particularly excited about the stratigraphy in Trench D9. Here, the Middle Bronze Age or Early Kurgan period is represented by two distinct phases, the Badeni and later Trialeti Middle Bronze Age cultures, which are clearly visible in the section. But unlike other settlements in the South Caucasus, where the post-early Bronze Age culture is mostly associated with burial evidence, Rabati is providing evidence of these Middle Bronze Age cultures in a settlement context. Now, undoubtedly, some of the most significant findings thus far are the results of the C14 analysis. 4 absolute dates have so far been determined for the early Bronze Age, and they fall between about 3000 and 2600 BC, a time that corresponds to the so-called height of regionalism of the Kura-Araxes period, when their classic red and black pottery was at its peak. And the C4 readings for the Middle Bronze Age levels collectively present a strong chronological trend ranging from about 2400 to about 1800. Now in 2024, this season, the focus of our work shifted to the burial grounds, to the south of the settlement. And here on the outskirts of the village are located multiple, bless you, kurgans. Now a word about kurgans, a Russian word, basically burial mound, tumuli, grave, high grave. These kurgans are very conspicuous features in the landscape, and at least 14 of them have been identified at Rabati, and there are many other potential mounds in the vicinity. This type of mortuary practice begins to occur in the South Caucasus during the second half of the 3rd millennium. Now, a little warning. In a few slides, I'm going to show some skeletal material. So if that's something that's problematic, just look away. So this season, we excavated a complex comprising 3 kurgans. In the centre was discovered a burial chamber constructed of large stones that had been disturbed and remodelled in more recent times, possibly for storage or to house livestock. Fragments of Middle Bronze Age pottery and a few other artefacts were found in situ. On either side of this kurgan were 2 smaller burials. Of particular interest, and at a slightly lower elevation, near the southwest corner of the central kurgan were 2 circular cist burials. The smallest one was empty, except for some fragments of pottery and cow teeth, but the larger cist contained the remains of 7 disarticulated skeletons, including 4 adult and 3 child skulls. The bones were concentrated around the interior edges of the burial. Access to the grave was through an opening at the eastern end, and the pottery found in this burial was typical of the early Bronze Age Kura-Araxes culture. The presence of the early Bronze Age cist graves, so close to the Middle Bronze Age kurgans, together was unexpected. Their appearance is significant because it's not been previously documented at Rabati before. It indicates that the area was used as a burial ground over a relatively long period of time. Now, this feeds into notions of social and cultural memory, where the later Middle Bronze Kurgan people communities returned to the early Bronze Age Kura-Araxes locations, especially to bury their dead. Now, the Gaia Project recently signed an MOU with Philip Stockhammer, co-director of the Max Planck Harvard Research Centre for the Archaeoscience of the Ancient Mediterranean. He might have been here in Sydney recently. Perhaps you, yeah. To undertake archaeogenetic analysis of the skeletal material from Rabati that will trace biological relatedness in the communal grave, as well as radiocarbon dating selected samples with sufficient ancient DNA preservation. Traces of continuity or social and cultural memory have also been detected in the material remains from Rabati. Co-director Dr. Claudia Sagona has been tracking these developments in ceramic artefacts, trades, hards, vessels and decoration. And significantly, traces of continuity between the early Bronze Age Kura-Araxes and the Middle Bronze Age or early Kurgan has also been detected in the archaeobotanical and archaeozoological data, supporting cultural transition rather than cultural discontinuity between the 2 phases. Returning to Paul's suggested topic for tonight, we did wonder if you would like to speak from the perspective of a researcher unable to return to Syria and how you compensate. Well, my archaeological experiences in Syria are certainly not lost or wasted in Georgia. Collaboration and community are just as much a part of our work at Rabati as they were in Tell Ahmar or in Tel Gumluk. The Gaia Project is living up to the aims of a true collaboration between equal partners and is one of the strongest cultural links between Georgia and Australia. Rabati continues a long tradition of Australian research projects, many of them coming from the University of Sydney, working in the Middle East. All these projects provide valuable fieldwork and training opportunities for Australians, making them job ready for employment in academic positions and related fields in cultural heritage and beyond. With those peer review comments that I mentioned at the start of tonight's talk, and the references to no record or impact in the context of the South Caucasus in mind, I hope our recent publications on Rabati address some of these concerns. Fortunately, the ARC, or the Australian Research Council, is not the only show in town, and we are very grateful to the following funding agencies that support our research: the Shota Rustaveli National Scientific Foundation of Georgia, the British Institute at Ankara, and the UK's National Environmental Research Council's National Environmental Isotope Facility that have generously provided funding. Gaia is also very grateful for the generous contribution it's received from the Antonio Sagona Research Fund and from other kind patrons, in particular Wallace Cameron, Heather Jackson, Robert Hook, Yolan Kerridge, David J. and Kim Wright. Post-excavation collections management remains a priority, just as it did in Syria. Responses to the conflict in Syria that included the creation of Shirin generated other new initiatives, challenging existing organisations, and such as the creation of AWA, a more ethically structured association. Finally, I started this talk by outlining the historical context of Near Eastern archaeology at Melbourne. At the university's open day, I meet dozens of students. Many of them comment they want to come to Melbourne because we offer ancient Near Eastern studies. I also mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I'm retaining Near Eastern because it refers to the ancient times, that is the ancient Near East. And in the Melbourne context, Ancient Near Eastern Studies is the name of our journal, published by Peters in Leuven, devoted to the languages and cultures of the ancient Near East, that's been going now for 60 years. And despite the troubles, my hope is ANES, in all its forms, will be around for another 60 years. I'll leave you now with a quote from one of our students, which vindicates and validates this perspective and compensation. This was one of the most life-changing experiences of my degree. I loved everything about it. The time together in Tbilisi, living in Zveli, working on a real site, meeting and getting to know the Georgians, the interesting lectures, and spending time with other like-minded students. The practical knowledge, the experience were such crucial elements that enrich my degree and increase my likelihood of employability. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Mark, I should say, if you're not doing anything in June and July in 2025, come to Georgia. Come and visit us.